The day I walked away from my empire, nobody asked if I was afraid. They only asked who had changed my mind. Rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moretti Tower, turning the Manhattan skyline into a blur of silver lights and shadows. 48 stories below, traffic crawled through the wet streets like streams of red and white stars. Inside the conference room, nobody spoke. 12 people sat around a table carved from dark walnut, each of them waiting for me to say something that would make sense of what they had just heard. I looked down at the ring resting in my palm. 3 generations of Moretti men had worn it. It wasn't worth much by itself. Just gold and black stone. But what it represented was another story. Influence. Expectations. A legacy so heavy that most people spent their entire lives trying to earn a fraction of it. Slowly, I placed the ring on the polished surface of the table. The sound it made was almost laughably small. A soft click. Yet somehow it echoed through the room louder than thunder. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the rain seemed to stop. Damien, one of the older men, finally said, "You don't mean that." I turned toward the window instead of answering. My reflection stared back at me. 35 years old. Custom suit. Perfect tie. A face the business magazines loved to photograph and the city preferred not to question. To most people, I was a success story. A man who could buy almost anything. But reflections never showed the whole truth. They couldn't show the sleepless nights. They couldn't show the silence waiting inside an empty penthouse after midnight. They couldn't show how exhausted a person could become from winning. "It's done," I said quietly. "I'm finished." The room erupted into disbelief. Questions collided with each other. Voices rose. Chairs shifted. Somebody stood. Somebody else swore under their breath. I heard none of it. My attention remained fixed on the rain sliding down the glass. Because for the first time in 15 years, my future wasn't sitting in that room. It wasn't buried inside contracts, investments, or family expectations. It was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere smaller. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere I never expected to matter. My hand slipped into my coat pocket. My fingers found the folded piece of paper I had carried for months. The edges were worn now. Soft from being opened too many times. Nobody in that room knew it existed. Nobody knew that a single handwritten note had become more valuable to me than everything surrounding us. I closed my eyes for a moment and remembered the handwriting. Simple. Careful. Kind. The exact opposite of the world I had spent my life building. And suddenly I wasn't standing in a skyscraper anymore. I was thinking about a woman I hadn't even noticed the first day she walked into my mansion. A woman who arrived carrying a cleaning cart and left carrying something far more dangerous. My peace. The rain continued falling against the glass. Behind me, the arguments grew louder. Ahead of me, Manhattan glowed beneath the storm. And somewhere in the distance, 9 months in the past, Claire Bennett was about to walk through the front doors of my estate and change everything. 9 months earlier, the first thing I noticed that morning was the smell of rain drifting through an open window somewhere inside the estate. The second was that somebody had moved a photograph. It should not have mattered. People imagine men like me spend their days making decisions worth millions of dollars. The truth is that routine becomes its own form of control. Every object in my house had a place. Every schedule had a purpose. Every detail remained exactly where it belonged. That photograph had sat crooked on a hallway table for almost 3 weeks because nobody had dared touch it without permission. Yet as I walked through the East Wing with a cup of black coffee in my hand, I stopped. The silver frame was straight. Perfectly straight. Sunlight spilled across the polished surface, catching the faces inside the picture. My parents. My younger sister. Me. A lifetime ago. I stared at it longer than I should have. "Who moved this?" I asked. The house manager glanced toward the table. I am not sure, sir. I set down my coffee. Something about the answer irritated me. Not because someone had touched the frame. Because someone had noticed it at all. Most people walked through the mansion seeing marble floors, chandeliers, and expensive artwork. They never saw the small things. They never saw what was missing. The house manager checked his tablet. There is a new cleaner assigned to the property this week. I almost walked away. Almost. Then I heard laughter. Soft. Genuine. The kind that did not belong inside a place like this. The sound drifted from the library doorway at the end of the corridor. Curious despite myself, I followed it. The library was one of the quietest rooms in the mansion. Floor-to-ceiling shelves. Leather chairs. Tall windows overlooking 10 acres of rain-soaked gardens. Standing near one of the shelves was a woman pushing a cleaning cart. She could not have been more than 27. Blonde hair tied back. Simple gray uniform. No jewelry except a small silver bracelet. She was kneeling beside an elderly groundskeeper who looked embarrassed by the attention. "There," she said with a smile. "Now it is fixed." The old man looked down at his glasses. One arm had apparently come loose. Somehow she had repaired them using a tiny screwdriver from her cart. "You did not have to do that," he told her. "I know," she replied. "But now you can actually read your newspaper." The old man laughed again. So did she. Neither noticed me standing there. For a strange moment, I simply watched. Nobody spoke to employees that way. Nobody stopped their work to help with something so small. Most people were too busy. Too important. Yet she acted as if fixing a pair of broken glasses was the most natural thing in the world. Then she finally looked up. Our eyes met across the room. Her smile disappeared instantly. Not from fear. From surprise. "I am sorry," she said, standing quickly. "I did not realize anyone was here. I should have nodded and left." Instead, I found myself asking a question I could not explain. "What is your name?" She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Claire Bennett." The rain tapped softly against the windows behind her. And although I did not know it yet, that was the moment everything began to change. For the next few days, I told myself Claire Bennett was none of my concern. Employees came and went. Contractors rotated through the estate every month. Their names rarely stayed with me longer than a meeting. Yet somehow hers did. The morning after our conversation in the library, I found myself noticing things I normally ignored. A fresh vase of white flowers appeared in a hallway that had felt empty for years. A stack of old magazines in the sunroom had been organized by date. Even the grand piano in the west wing gleamed as though someone had taken extra care with it. Small details. Meaningless details. But they changed the atmosphere of the house in ways I could not explain. One Thursday afternoon, a cold wind rolled across the property as gray clouds gathered over the gardens. I had spent most of the day reviewing reports in my office. Numbers. Contracts. Endless decisions. By the time I stepped into the main hallway, my head ached. That was when I heard music. Not from the speakers hidden throughout the mansion. Real music. Soft piano notes drifting from the west wing. Curious despite myself, I followed the sound. The room was empty except for Claire. She was standing beside the piano with a dust cloth in one hand. The lid was open. A recording played quietly from her phone resting on the bench. She was not performing. She was cleaning while humming along to the melody. For some reason, she looked completely at peace. She had not noticed me. I should have turned around. Instead, I remained in the doorway. Then her eyes landed on a framed photograph sitting on top of the piano. Her smile faded. She picked it up carefully. The frame held a picture of my younger sister, Sophia. She had passed away many years ago after a long illness. Most people avoided mentioning her. Even employees seemed to sense the subject was forbidden. Claire brushed a bit of dust from the corner of the frame. Then she set it down with remarkable gentleness. "She looks kind," she whispered to herself. The words hit me harder than they should have. Claire suddenly realized she was no longer alone. Her eyes widened when she saw me standing there. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I was only cleaning." I glanced toward the photograph. Most people do not stop long enough to notice it. Her expression softened. Maybe they are too busy looking at everything else. The answer surprised me. "And what do you see?" I asked. Claire looked around the enormous room. Expensive artwork. Crystal chandeliers. Marble columns. Everything people usually admired. But her gaze returned to the photograph. "Honestly," she said, "I see a family that probably misses someone." The room fell silent. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the hills. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Claire lowered her eyes. "I should get back to work." She walked toward her cleaning cart and left the room. I remained there long after she disappeared. Staring at the photograph. Thinking about her words. Because for the first time in years, someone had walked through my mansion and seen something other than wealth. And I could not stop wondering why that mattered so much. Sleep became a stranger after that conversation. Not because Claire had said anything extraordinary. Quite the opposite. Her words were simple. Honest. The kind of words most people stopped speaking once money entered the room. 3 nights later, I sat alone in my office overlooking the North Gardens. The digital clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. Rain drifted across the windows in soft waves. A stack of contracts sat untouched on my desk. I had been staring at the same page for nearly 20 minutes without reading a single line. My attention kept wandering. Finally, I pushed away from the desk and walked through the silent mansion. The halls felt different at night. Larger somehow. Emptier. Every footstep echoed against marble and stone. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped. A warm light glowed beneath the doorway. Someone was still awake. That alone was unusual. Most employees left hours earlier. Curious, I stepped inside. Claire stood near the counter holding a ceramic mug. She looked startled when she saw me. "I am sorry," she said immediately. "I did not realize anyone was working this late." I glanced toward the mug. Steam curled into the air. "Chamomile tea." "Neither did I," I replied. Claire smiled awkwardly. "The cleaning crew finished early. I stayed behind because one of the storage rooms needed extra work." Her eyes moved to the dark circles beneath mine. Before I could say anything else, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "Actually," she said, placing it on the counter, "I was going to leave this here anyway." I looked down. "What is it?" "A suggestion." The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "You do not have to follow it." I unfolded the note. Written in neat handwriting were only a few words. "If your mind refuses to rest, stop fighting it. Make tea. Open a window. Breathe for 5 minutes. The world can wait until morning." I stared at the message longer than necessary. Nobody had spoken to me that way in years. Most people offered solutions. Advice. Strategies. Claire had offered something else entirely. Permission. "You think tea solves everything?" I asked. A quiet laugh escaped her. "No. But sometimes people need a reminder that they are human." The answer caught me off guard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, an old grandfather clock chimed 2:30. Claire glanced toward the door. "I should finish cleaning." Then she hesitated. "For what it is worth, you look exhausted." Before I could respond, she picked up her supplies and disappeared down the hallway. The kitchen fell silent again. I looked down at the note still resting in my hand. Simple words. Ordinary words. Yet something about them stayed with me. Later that night, I found myself opening the office window despite the cold air. I made tea. I sat in silence. And for the first time in months, I slept more than 4 hours. The next morning, I folded the note carefully and placed it inside my coat pocket. I told myself it was temporary. A meaningless piece of paper. I did not know then that I would carry it with me for the next 9 months. The following week, I started noticing something even more dangerous than Claire's kindness. I started looking for it. Every morning brought another excuse to pass through a different wing of the estate. Another reason to leave my office. Another reason to pay attention to details I had ignored for years. One afternoon, sunlight spilled across the south courtyard after 3 straight days of rain. The gardens shimmered beneath the clear sky. I was reviewing a phone call near the balcony when I noticed movement below. Claire sat on a stone bench beside Mr. Henderson, the elderly groundskeeper whose glasses she had repaired. He looked unusually tired. His shoulders slumped forward as he stared at the fountain. Claire handed him a paper bag and a bottle of water. Even from a distance, I could see him trying to refuse. She insisted anyway. Eventually he accepted. Curious, I ended my call and headed downstairs. By the time I reached the courtyard, Claire was already gathering her supplies. Mr. Henderson looked embarrassed when he noticed me. "Everything all right?" I asked. The older man nodded too quickly. Claire answered before he could. "He skipped lunch again." Mr. Henderson sighed. "I was busy." "You were stubborn," Claire corrected. A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth before I could stop it. The old man pointed accusingly toward her. "See? This is exactly what I have been dealing with." Claire laughed. "Somebody has to keep an eye on you." For a few moments, the three of us stood there beneath the warm afternoon sun. The scene felt strangely normal. Ordinary. Something I had not experienced in a very long time. After Mr. Henderson returned to work, Claire picked up her cart. "You did not have to buy him lunch," I said. She shrugged. "Actually, I did." "Why?" She looked genuinely confused by the question. "Because he was hungry." I stared at her. "That simple?" "Most important things are." Then she started walking toward the service entrance. Halfway there, she stopped. "Can I ask you something?" Nobody asked me casual questions. Employees usually spoke carefully around me. "Go ahead," I said. Claire glanced toward the enormous mansion behind us. "Do you ever enjoy it?" I frowned. "Enjoy what?" She gestured toward the estate. "All of this. The gardens. The fountains. The view. You have one of the most beautiful properties I have ever seen, but every time I see you, you look like you are carrying the weight of the world." The words landed harder than she realized. Before I could answer, Claire smiled apologetically. "Forget it. That was probably too personal." She disappeared inside the building. I remained standing in the courtyard long after she left. Looking at the gardens. Looking at the fountains. Looking at the estate I had spent years expanding. Then I realized something uncomfortable. I could not remember the last time I had actually stopped to enjoy any of it. And for the first time, I found myself wondering if Claire Bennett saw something missing in my life that I had been too busy to notice myself. By the beginning of summer, something inside the estate had shifted. Employees smiled more often. The halls felt warmer. Even the staff dinners that happened once a month seemed louder with conversation. Nobody could explain why. I could. Claire Bennett had a habit of making people feel seen. One Friday evening, golden sunlight stretched across the property as the day slowly faded into dusk. I was leaving a meeting when I noticed Claire sitting alone on the back terrace. She was not working. That alone caught my attention. A notebook rested on her lap. Her expression looked distant. Thoughtful. For a moment, I considered walking away. Then I noticed something unusual. She was staring at her phone with the same look people wore when they were trying not to worry. Before I could change my mind, I stepped outside. Claire looked up, clearly surprised to see me. "You are still here?" she asked. "I could ask you the same thing." She smiled faintly. "Fair enough." The evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the gardens. Somewhere in the distance, sprinklers clicked softly across the lawn. I glanced toward the notebook. "What are you writing?" Claire hesitated. "Just keeping track of expenses." Her answer sounded rehearsed. "That exciting?" I asked. A small laugh escaped her. "Not exactly." Then her smile faded. "My younger brother has a medical condition. Nothing life-threatening, but the treatments are expensive." She immediately looked embarrassed for sharing. "Sorry. That was probably too much information." I leaned against the railing. "How old is he?" 19. Her face softened instantly. "His name is Ethan." The way she said his name told me everything. She adored him. "He starts community college this fall if everything goes according to plan." "If?" Claire looked down at the notebook. "Medical bills have a way of changing plans." The word stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Later that night, I sat alone in my office. The city lights glowed beyond the windows. Reports waited on my desk. Calls needed returning. Yet my thoughts kept drifting back to Claire and the worn notebook she carried everywhere. Finally, I picked up the phone. One call. Then another. Quiet conversations. Careful instructions. Nothing traced back to me. The next week, a local charitable foundation unexpectedly expanded a scholarship program for students facing medical hardship. Ethan Bennett became one of the recipients. Full tuition assistance. Additional support for treatment expenses. Anonymous donor. I learned about it 3 days later when I passed Claire in the hallway. She looked happier than I had ever seen her. Relief radiated from her entire face. "Something good happened," I said. Claire stopped walking. "The best thing." Her eyes shined with emotion. "My brother received help. Real help." "I still cannot believe it." I nodded. "That is good news." She smiled so brightly that for a second the entire hallway seemed brighter too. Then she continued on her way, completely unaware of the truth. I watched her disappear around the corner. For years, I had spent money on acquisitions, expansions, and projects that people celebrated publicly. Yet none of those victories felt remotely similar to this moment. And for the first time, I began to understand something dangerous. Making Claire happy mattered to me far more than it should have. By late summer, Claire had become part of the rhythm of the estate in a way nobody could have predicted. Employees greeted her by name. The kitchen staff saved her favorite blueberry muffins. Even Mr. Henderson claimed the gardens grew better when she walked through them. I told myself I was simply observing. Nothing more. Then one afternoon changed everything. The air smelled of fresh rain as dark clouds gathered over the property. I had just finished a meeting when my chief of staff entered my office carrying a folder. His expression looked unusually cautious. "There is something you should probably see," he said. He placed the folder on my desk and stepped back. Inside were routine background reports connected to contractors working on the estate. Normally I never looked at them. This time one name caught my attention immediately. Claire Bennett. I felt an uncomfortable tension settle in my chest. The report itself was harmless. Employment history. References. Financial records. Then I reached the final page. There was a photograph. Not of Claire. Of her father. My eyes narrowed. The name meant nothing at first. Then recognition arrived like a distant echo. 20 years ago, before I inherited leadership responsibilities, my family had been involved in a major redevelopment project in Brooklyn. Hundreds of jobs. Hundreds of families. One company among many had collapsed during the transition. The report connected Claire's father to that company. I read the page twice. Then a third time. A cold feeling settled over me. The details were incomplete, but one fact stood out clearly. Claire's family had suffered because of decisions linked to the Moretti organization long before she ever stepped foot inside this estate. The office suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. I stared out the window toward the gardens below. Claire had no idea. As far as she knew, I was simply the owner of the property where she worked. She did not know the history. She did not know the connection. Yet something told me that if she ever discovered it, everything would change. That evening I found her in the sunroom organizing books onto a shelf. The setting sun painted the room gold. Dust floated through beams of light like tiny stars. Claire smiled when she saw me. "Good evening." I opened my mouth to answer, but the words never came. For the first time since meeting her, I felt guilty standing in front of her. Not because of something I had personally done. Because of something attached to my name. "Is everything okay?" she asked. I realized I had been staring. "Yes," I said quietly. "Just tired." Claire studied me for a moment. Then she reached into her cleaning cart and handed me a small wrapped piece of chocolate. "Emergency supply," she said. "For difficult days." Despite everything weighing on my mind, I laughed. She smiled in return and went back to arranging books. I stood there watching her for several seconds. Watching someone who trusted me completely without realizing how complicated the truth really was. And for the first time since Claire Bennett entered my life, I found myself afraid of what might happen when the past finally caught up with us. The first cold winds of autumn arrived sooner than expected. Leaves scattered across the estate grounds in shades of gold and amber, carried by a restless breeze that rattled the windows each morning. For weeks, I had avoided looking deeper into the report about Claire's family. I convinced myself it did not matter. The past was complicated. The connection was indirect. Nothing good would come from reopening old wounds. Then fate made the decision for me. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I returned to the estate earlier than planned and walked into the library searching for a quiet place to think. The room was empty. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed a folder sitting on one of the reading tables. My folder. The same report I had left locked inside my office. My pulse immediately quickened. I crossed the room and opened it. Several pages had been moved. One sheet was missing entirely. A terrible feeling settled in my chest. Before I could process it, I heard footsteps behind me. Claire stood in the doorway. Her face looked pale. Her eyes were red as though she had spent hours fighting back tears. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. Finally, she looked down at the missing page in her hand. "Was it true?" she asked quietly. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I already knew which page she meant. The one connecting her father's company to decisions made decades ago under the Moretti name. I swallowed hard. "Claire. Please." She shook her head. "Just tell me if it was true." For the first time since I met her, I did not know what to say. Not because I wanted to lie. Because no explanation sounded good enough. Her eyes searched mine. Waiting. Hoping. Maybe even begging me to deny it. But I could not. "Part of it is true," I admitted. The pain that crossed her face was almost impossible to watch. She looked away immediately. "All these months," she whispered. "You knew." The accusation was quiet. Somehow that made it worse. "I only learned recently," I said. And I never wanted to hurt you. Claire laughed softly, but there was no happiness in the sound. You do not understand. She looked toward the window where rain had started falling against the glass. My father spent years blaming himself. He thought he failed us. Her voice trembled. Do you know how many nights he sat at our kitchen table wondering what he could have done differently? I stepped forward. Claire. She backed away. Not out of fear. Out of disappointment. The distance hurt far more than anger would have. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. Then she placed the missing page on the table. I need time. Those 4 words shattered something inside me. Before I could answer, she turned and walked away. I followed her into the hallway. By the time I reached the front entrance, she was already gone. The rain swallowed her silhouette as she disappeared down the long driveway. I stood there watching until there was nothing left to see. And for the first time in many years, the mansion felt unbearably empty. The days that followed moved with the strange heaviness of winter arriving too early. Every room in the mansion felt colder, even when the fireplaces burned. Every hallway seemed larger. Quieter. I kept expecting to hear Claire's footsteps somewhere in the distance or catch sight of her cleaning cart turning a corner. Instead, there was only silence. 1 week passed. Then another. She never returned. Nobody blamed her. Not even the staff. Especially not the staff. They missed her as much as I did. Mr. Henderson stopped taking his lunch breaks in the courtyard. The kitchen felt subdued. Conversations ended faster than they used to. It was remarkable how much absence one person could create. I buried myself in work. At least I tried to. Meetings filled the calendar. Contracts crossed my desk. Advisors talked for hours about expansion plans and investment opportunities. Yet none of it held my attention. One afternoon, I found myself staring out a conference room window while 3 executives discussed numbers worth more money than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Not a single word registered. Finally, one of them cleared his throat. Damien? I looked up. What? The room exchanged confused glances. I had not heard the last 5 minutes of conversation. After the meeting ended, I walked alone through Manhattan. No security detail. No assistance. No destination. Just cold air and crowded sidewalks. The city moved around me exactly as it always had. Taxi horns echoed through the streets. Steam rose from sidewalk grates. People rushed toward places they believed mattered. Yet everything felt strangely distant. For years I thought success would eventually create peace. Instead, it had only created more responsibility. More expectations. More walls. Claire had been the first person who never seemed impressed by any of it. She cared about people. About gardens. About old photographs and hungry groundskeepers and scholarship opportunities for strangers. She cared about things that could not be measured. That realization followed me all the way home. Late that evening, I entered the library and stopped. The repaired glasses still rested on the side table where Mr. Henderson occasionally left them. The piano remained polished. The flowers in the hallway had been replaced by someone else, but they were not arranged the way Claire used to arrange them. Small details. Meaningless details. Except they were not meaningless anymore. I sat alone in the library until after midnight. Eventually my eyes landed on a book tucked between 2 shelves. A small piece of paper stuck out from the pages. Curious, I pulled it free. My breath caught. It was Claire's handwriting. Just a grocery list she must have forgotten months earlier. Nothing important. Milk. Bread. Coffee. Yet I stood there holding it as though it were priceless. Because it was proof that she had been here. Proof that everything had actually happened. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket beside the note she had given me months before. Then I closed my eyes. And for the first time, I admitted a truth I had spent weeks avoiding. I did not miss Claire because she made the mansion feel different. I missed her because she had changed me. And I had absolutely no idea how to live without that. The first snowfall arrived on a gray November morning. Thin flakes drifted across the estate grounds, settling on stone pathways and bare branches like a quiet reminder that another season had passed. Claire had been gone for nearly 7 weeks. 7 weeks of meetings that felt meaningless. 7 weeks of empty hallways. 7 weeks of pretending that work could fill a space it had never been designed to fill. One morning, I arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The city outside was still dark. My office windows reflected only shadows and scattered lights. A stack of internal reports waited on my desk. Normally, I would have delegated them. Instead, I opened the first file simply to keep my mind occupied. By noon, I had discovered something I wished I had never seen. Buried beneath years of financial summaries and project reviews were decisions made long before I took direct control of operations. Legal. Profitable. Efficient. And devastating for ordinary families caught in the middle. Communities displaced. Small businesses forced to close. Workers left behind while investors celebrated. None of it violated the law. That somehow made it worse. I sat back in my chair and stared at the pages. Suddenly, Claire's question returned to me. Do you ever enjoy it? At the time, I thought she was talking about the estate. Now I realized she might have been asking something much larger. What exactly had all of this been for? That afternoon, I left the office and drove through parts of Brooklyn I had not visited in years. Snow fell steadily against the windshield. Old brick buildings lined the streets. Family-owned stores sat beside coffee shops and laundromats. Real people living real lives. The kind of lives that never appeared in boardroom presentations. Eventually, I found the neighborhood connected to Claire's family history. Much of it had changed. New construction stood where older buildings once existed. Progress, according to the reports. Yet standing there, I felt none of the pride I was supposed to feel. Only regret. Nearby, a small community center displayed a bulletin board filled with photographs. Local events. Scholarship recipients. Volunteer projects. One picture caught my attention immediately. Claire stood beside a group of teenagers holding donated school supplies. She was smiling the same way she smiled when helping Mr. Henderson or talking about Ethan. Completely genuine. Completely unaware that someone was watching. I stood there for several minutes staring at that photograph. Then I noticed something else. A plaque beneath the board listed contributors to the center. Families. Teachers. Retirees. People giving what little they could. None of them were powerful. None of them controlled corporations or estates. Yet somehow they were creating more good than entire divisions of my organization. The realization followed me all the way back to Manhattan. Late that night, I sat alone in my office overlooking the city. The lights stretched endlessly across the skyline. Once, that view made me feel invincible. Now it only made me feel tired. Because the deeper I looked into the empire I had inherited, the more I understood something Claire had recognized long before I did. Success built without compassion leaves behind a very expensive kind of emptiness. December arrived wrapped in snow and silence. The city decorated itself with lights, music, and holiday displays, but none of it reached me. Every celebration felt distant, like something happening behind glass. 3 months earlier, I would have spent this season negotiating deals, hosting events, and discussing next year's expansion plans. Instead, I spent most evenings alone in my office reading reports I should have examined years ago. The more I learned, the less comfortable I became. One snowy afternoon, I was called into a meeting with the senior board members who oversaw the largest parts of the organization. The conference room overlooked the Hudson River. Gray water stretched beneath an equally gray sky. The atmosphere felt tense from the moment I walked in. Nobody offered their usual greetings. Nobody smiled. One of the directors slid a folder across the table. "We need to discuss a problem," he said. I opened the folder. My chest tightened immediately. Claire. Her name appeared several times throughout the documents. Community records. Scholarship programs. Volunteer activities. Nothing unusual. Nothing threatening. Yet someone had spent considerable effort gathering information about her life. I looked up slowly. Why? The room exchanged uneasy glances. Another director leaned forward. Because she knows things connected to the family's history. I stared at him. History from 20 years ago. History is still history. His voice remained calm. Too calm. The organization cannot afford unnecessary attention. The words filled me with a sudden anger I had not felt in years. Not because they were discussing Claire. Because of how they were discussing her. Like she was a problem to be managed instead of a person. She has done nothing wrong, I said. That is not the point. Then what is? Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable silence. Finally, one of the older board members folded his hands together. You have changed, Damien. The statement landed harder than any accusation. Because it was true. 6 months ago, I probably would have agreed with them. 6 months ago, I measured success differently. Now all I could think about was a woman who spent her free time helping strangers and worrying about her younger brother. A woman whose biggest mistake had been believing I was someone worth trusting. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. This discussion is over. Several faces hardened immediately. You are making an emotional decision. I stood. No. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. For the first time in my life, I am making the right one. Nobody spoke as I walked toward the door. Behind me, the room remained frozen in stunned silence. Outside, snow drifted across the city skyline. I stood beside the window for a long moment watching it fall. And for the first time I understood something that terrified me. The greatest threat to everything I had built was not Claire Bennett. It was the realization that I no longer believed the empire was worth protecting at any cost. Christmas lights covered Manhattan in color, but the city had never felt darker to me. 2 days after the board meeting, I was summoned back into the same conference room overlooking the Hudson. Snow drifted past the windows in slow spirals. The river below looked like steel beneath the winter sky. This time there was no pretense. No polite introductions. No carefully chosen language. The moment I entered, I knew a line had been drawn. The chairman folded his hands and looked directly at me. You leave us with no choice. I sat down without answering. Another folder waited on the table. I did not bother opening it. I already knew what it contained. More discussions about risk. More arguments about protecting the organization. More reasons why human beings should be treated like numbers. Claire Bennett knows enough to create complications, one director said. We need guarantees. I looked around the room. 12 faces. 12 people who had spent decades teaching me how to think. How to calculate. How to prioritize power above everything else. Yet for the first time, they looked like strangers. You are still talking about her like she is a problem, I said quietly. She is not. The chairman sighed. Damien, this is bigger than one woman. I almost laughed. Because that was exactly what I used to believe. Bigger deals. Bigger projects. Bigger ambitions. Everything always had to be bigger. Until Claire taught me that sometimes the most important things were small enough to fit inside a handwritten note. No, I said. The problem is that all of you have forgotten what this was supposed to be about. The room fell silent. One director leaned forward. And what is that supposed to mean? I thought about Mr. Henderson. About Ethan. About the community center in Brooklyn. About a woman who fixed broken glasses because someone needed help reading a newspaper. People, I answered. It was always supposed to be about people. Nobody responded. Their expressions told me everything. They could not understand what had changed inside me because they had never met the person responsible for changing it. Finally, the chairman slid a document across the table. Then make your choice. I looked down. A formal transition agreement. Leadership succession. Resignation terms. Months ago, the sight would have shocked me. Now it felt strangely peaceful. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the glass. I remembered Claire asking whether I ever enjoyed any of it. The mansion. The success. The empire. At the time, I had no answer. Now I finally did. I had spent years building a life that impressed everyone except myself. Slowly, I picked up the pen. Several directors shifted uneasily. One of them spoke my name. Another tried to reason with me. Their voices faded into background noise. My signature appeared on the final page. One line. A few seconds. 15 years ended. When I set down the pen, a strange calm settled over me. The weight I had carried for so long simply disappeared. Nobody celebrated. Nobody spoke. They only stared. Because they understood what had happened. I stood and buttoned my coat. "Where are you going?" someone finally asked. I thought about a small town 3 hours north of the city. About a modest apartment above a bookstore where Claire had recently taken a new job. About a woman who still had no idea how much she mattered. Then I smiled for the first time in months. To fix the only mistake that ever truly mattered. The drive north took just over 3 hours. Snow lined the roads in clean white blankets, covering fields and rooftops beneath a pale winter sky. For most of the trip, the radio remained off. I drove in silence, listening only to the sound of tires moving across frozen pavement. Somewhere behind me, Manhattan continued spinning exactly as it always had. Meetings. Contracts. Ambitions. Endless people chasing things they believed would make them happy. For years, I had been one of them. By the time I reached the small town, evening had settled across the streets. Warm yellow lights glowed through shop windows. Families carried shopping bags through the snow. A church bell echoed softly in the distance. Everything felt smaller than the world I had left behind. Somehow it also felt more real. The bookstore stood on a quiet corner near the center of town. A modest brick building with a green awning and frost gathering along the edges of the windows. Light spilled onto the sidewalk from inside. I sat in my car for a moment staring at the entrance. My pulse felt strangely unsteady. I had negotiated billion-dollar agreements without hesitation. Yet opening one bookstore door suddenly seemed impossible. Finally, I stepped outside. Cold air filled my lungs. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the glow of nearby street lamps. The bell above the door chimed softly when I entered. The smell of coffee and old books wrapped around me immediately. A few customers browsed shelves near the back. Gentle music played somewhere overhead. Then I saw her. Claire stood behind the register organizing a stack of books. For a second, everything else disappeared. The customers. The music. The snow outside. All of it faded. She looked up. Her hands froze. The book she was holding nearly slipped from her grasp. Neither of us moved. Months of silence stretched between us in a single moment. "Damien," she whispered. Hearing my name in her voice again felt like coming home after being lost for a very long time. I walked closer. "Hi, Claire." Her eyes searched my face as though she could not quite believe I was standing there. "What are you doing here?" I smiled faintly. "That is a long story." She folded her arms. Not angry. Cautious. Hurt. Understandably hurt. "Then maybe start with the short version." I looked around the bookstore. The shelves. the lights. The quiet life she had built for herself. Then I told her the truth. I left. Claire blinked. Left what? Everything. The confusion in her expression slowly shifted into disbelief. I reached into my coat pocket and removed the folded note she had given me months ago. The edges were worn from being carried every day. Her eyes widened when she recognized it. You kept that? She asked softly. I kept all of it. My voice caught slightly. The note. The grocery list. Every reminder of you. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I took a slow breath. Claire, I cannot change the past. I cannot undo what happened to your family. But I spent months looking at everything I'd built and realizing none of it meant anything if it cost me the person who taught me how to be better. Tears filled her eyes. Mine were not much steadier. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the windows. Inside, the world felt perfectly still. Claire looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. Then, very slowly, she smiled. It was the same smile that once brightened a mansion full of empty rooms. And in that instant, I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. I had spent most of my life building an empire. But the greatest thing I ever found was a reason to walk away from it.